All right, we are going live with the first ever Web Dev Office Hours. So, what am I going to do first? Let's get some screen shares going. What do I want to? Where do I want to start? Create a new. Okay, I know where I'm going to start. Okay, let's bring up our terminal. Over here, and then I can start sharing my screen. Cool. Looks like I'm sharing over there. Sounds good. We've got some terminals. Well, I'm using Windows, which I'm not used to. So let's see if we can bump up the screen size font. That might be a little bit better. Okay, that's looking good. Cool. So I'm in a folder. And why don't we talk about what we're actually going to be working on today? I have this idea in mind that as developers, I see a lot of applications that are JavaScript focused or centric. And we kind of use JavaScript to talk to APIs. So you have a website running, you use some JavaScript, you make a fetch request, you go over to some JSON API endpoint, and then bring that data back and update your UI. Now, that may happen in a framework or in a static app or something like that. But I've had this idea of how we can do that in a way that is progressively enhanced, where we can use basic HTML to send those requests and then progressively enhance it with JavaScript so that only if JavaScript is available do we send a fetch request. Otherwise, our API still works with just the HTML method. So we're going to build that. Let's get started over here. And let's see, I want to do that and that. Cool. Yeah, I think we're good. Okay, let's come over here and say make dir. What do we want to call this? Progressive Enhanced API. PP. This is live coding, so I did not think about that. There we go. Let's make it a little bit better. PE API, Progressive Enhanced API. Cool. We're going to switch into there. We are going to npm init and, well, let's npm init -y. And then that's going to make our npm package. And then we can git init, and that's going to initialize a Git repository. That's just going to get us all started. So then we can open up VS Code for this project. And I'm going to try to drag it over to my second screen. There we go. Cool. We've got our package.json file. I'm going to add some stuff here just because I don't want that. We'll get rid of that. Get rid of that, that, and that. And cool. So we probably don't need this main either. So we have our npm project set up. So now the other thing that I'm going to want to do is essentially build, I guess, my backend first. And I'm going to build that with a tool called Fastify. So let me do this. I'm going to open up an incognito browser and Fastify JS. So Fastify.io, that's going to be the website where all the information for Fastify is. I really like it. I got started working with Fastify recently, switching over from Express, mostly because it's built by a really awesome team. It is fast, although that's not necessarily the number one reason I want it. Although it's great, it has like some really cool built-in tools that I want for my API anyway, such as JSON schema for validation. It's got built-in logging, so I don't have to reach for third-party logging. I guess it's TypeScript ready, which is great. Yeah, so we're just kind of going to get started with one of these. Let's go with that, right? And actually, I'm going to change my project so it is a type of, not service, module. And that's going to let me use ES modules without needing a build step. Okay, cool. So we're there. Let's create a folder called source. And in there, we can create server.js. And I'm going to paste the stuff that I found from Fastify. We're going to say import Fastify from Fastify. Cool. That all looks good. There's some other stuff I want to do here before I get going too far. Do I want to put an ESLint folder file? I don't know. I do want to get some TypeScripty sort of support. So I'm actually going to add a tsconfig.json file. I have some things that pretty much have ready to go. I don't need this. This is just a file that I kind of copy and paste and bring around to every project. But this is going to let me enable the TypeScript language features in VS Code. So I can see, well, we'll see. I'll have some red squigglies when I run into errors, which is great. So now what I want to do is get with my server. Let's see. We have get here. If we run this, right, we need to run a development script. So before that, I think what I want to do is have, I think, an instance of nodemon set up. So we're going to do npm I install for dev dependencies nodemon. And this is a tool, if you're not familiar with, that basically will watch my files for changes. And when I make a change, it will essentially restart my app. So now that that's running or installed, we can go back to our package.json file, and we can say we're going to have a dev command that says nodemon server.js. Oh no, sorry. Source/server.js. If we go back here, we can say npm run dev. And Fastify has already been declared. Oh, right, because it was copied over as a common JS thing. So we're going to call this uppercase Fastify. And then we're going to say const, don't want to call it Fastify. Oh, oops. Looks like I copy and pasted this twice. There you go. So I want this to be, no, that was fine how it was. I'm going to say this is my server. And my server equals Fastify with some settings. And I'm going to say, and you might need to know this. Well, you probably don't know this just from watching, but essentially I want to enable logging on my server. Cool. That looks good so far. We're going to come back here. Ooh, we're going to restart that. Can I find package Fastify? Cool. Let's cancel that. And we're going to install Fastify. Okay. Let's get running dev. That looks a bit different. Looks like our server is being run. So now, if I go to localhost 3000, I can see my server running. Hello world. That's awesome. Great. We're off to a good start. So now what do I want to do? I want to actually send an HTML file instead of this hello world, right? So what we'll do first is we're going to create that index.html file. I'm going to copy and paste some stuff because I have that already. This part we don't need. Again, these are just like these are just some basic things. I do have a little bit of an addition of a library that I maintain, which is kind of like a basic reset. We can see what this is going to look like without that to begin with. Cool. Then we have the body tag in here. We can say like h1 hello world or hello Fastify. Cool. So that's set up. If we go back to our server, we're not going to see that change because we only created an index.html file. So in order to fix that, we need to go back to our code for our server. And we basically want Fastify to serve this file as index.html. And I don't think it does that by default. So what we need is a package in addition to our Fastify server. There we go. We need to install Fastify static. All right. And then inside our code, we're going to import that. Oops, Fastify static. This doesn't work like that. Oops, static. Unknown word. Oh, there you go. Figures it out. Okay, so now we need our server to kind of enable that. Fastify uses plugins, so that's essentially what we're doing here, is registering a new plugin. it's going to be the Fastify static plugin, which takes some options. One of them is where is the root? So I need to be able to tell it where the root is. And I think that this is all, well, let's see if we can have it be the source folder. Basically, I just want this to be where static files are served from, so the index.html gets served from there. So the second part of this is because we want to replace the hello world with the index.html file, we actually need to change this to from reply with or from returning just the JSON hello world, we want to do reply dot send file of index.html. Thank you, GitHub Copilot, for the assist. So if we refresh here, what do we get? Oh, we probably need to start our server. There we go. And we see that the app crashed. And why did the app crash? Because the root for our static files must be an absolute path. And here in our code, we are using a relative path. So this is kind of something that was, I guess, solved with CommonJS. We could have used dirname, which is a Node.js thing in CommonJS, but is not available to us using ES modules. However, one thing that we can do is sort of recreate that functionality. So what I'm going to do is come up here and import a path from Node's built-in modules and get the path module. And then I'm going to come here and say we're going to recreate dirname. And wow, GitHub Copilot for the win. That's pretty cool. Let me make sure that that actually is. Yeah, I think that's what I want. So then dirname is going to be the absolute path to this current or the directory in which this file exists. So that means we're using the path package, getting the directory name, and then we're using the import meta URL to get the URL for this package, and we're getting the path name for that package, if that's correct. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but essentially what we have here is this dirname is now going to be assigned or equal to the absolute path on the computer to this source directory, not just the relative path from the project itself. So with that in place, let's see if we still have errors. Looks like that error is fixed. And if we go back to our project and we reload, cool. We have hello Fastify, and this is an index.html file. So that's working just as we intended. And we are serving up those sweet static files. So now I'm going to go back here and bring back my little style sheet, reload that. And now we get some styles that I like, which are kind of a, I don't know, much more comfortable default starting place. Because my computer is set to use dark mode, it's going to kind of detect that and opt for dark mode versus light mode or whatever. So that's kind of cool. Now, what were we saying that we wanted to do? I think we're going to start by building a form. Do I want to build a form, or do I want to go with the JS? or like the server. Let's start by building a server endpoint. So we're going to say we're going to get another path here, and we're going to say server dot. We can do get or post. I think in this case, I want this to take all the traffic coming here. And we're going to say that we have this fake or whatever API endpoint. And this API endpoint is going to be, the route that is probably going to respond with JSON. Okay. So with that in place, let's see, we have the request object. We have the reply object, which is the Fastify convention. We're missing a little comma there. Thank you, VS Code, for the assist. And then we're going to, let's see, return. Let's go back with that hello world example that we had. So now if we go back to our page and we go to the API endpoint, we get our JSON response. Great. So far, so good. So what we want to do is essentially take our project, create a form, have that form be submitted, and have this API request essentially respond with JSON if it's a fetch request, and I guess redirect back to wherever the referrer is if it's a standard HTTP request. And that'll make sense here in a moment. Okay, how do we want to start with this? I'm going to start by building out this form. So let's go here. Let's go to index.html. We're going to say our form action is going to go to /API. Our form method is going to be, I think, a post request is what I'm going to go with. We're going to send some data, whatever. And then we will start with just a name. We're going to start with a name. So an input of type text that's going to say, what's your name? So in order to do that, I need a couple things. An input on its own is not great for accessibility. It also needs a label. So the label is going to be for name. It's going to ask me what my name is. In order to connect a label with an input, we have a number of options. We can wrap the label around the input, and then you see how my little squiggly is gone. I had a squiggly there before because I have some linting on, Axe linter, that tells me to ensure every form label or every form input has a label. So that is fixed. In fact, this is what's called a, let me remove that. So this is what's called an implicit label. And this works well enough for most assistive technology, for screen readers and things like that. However, if you really want to go full on accessible, you should probably still include the for attribute and the name or the ID. The reason we do this is because some voice control devices do not currently work with implicit labels. And so we want explicit, which is this for and this ID. Great. The other thing missing here is I want to have a name. Well, let's show this really quick. Let's change this to a GET request, and let's say that the target is blank. Cool. One other thing my form needs is a button of type equals submit. Say submit form. All right, going back to our page, we've got our input name, we've got our submit form. If we say my name is Austin and I submit the form, it's going to do what HTML does by default, which is essentially reload the page. Now, because I gave the form attribute of target.blank, it's going to do the default behavior in a new tab. But otherwise, it would be reloading this page. And we sent a GET request. Let's see here. Our form, the action is to this /API route when we're using the GET method. And why that's relevant is because when we submit the form, it's going to send our data to the route or the URL that we told it to. So in this case, /API. And it's going to use the GET method, which means it's going to send the data in the query string parameters. So we can see here that we have not actually sent any data. And the reason why is because our form inputs do not have names. So that's why it's important to always include the name. Now, if I hit save, I go back to my form, I can submit it once I have to reload and then submit that again. And now we can see that our form is submitting, it's sending to the correct API endpoint, and it's sending the data where name is Austin. Cool. On a post request, the same sort of thing will happen, but the data will be sent in the body of the request, not in the URL. So that's why, if you're ever dealing with sensitive data or you're not sure, we should use a post request. But for demo purposes, it makes it a lot easier if I use a GET request, because then we can kind of review that a lot in the URL. Cool. Is anyone here so far? Is anyone watching the show? I don't know. Maybe. Looks like we've got someone watching the show. I'll just give you a little wave. I'm a little busy right now, though, so get back to that. Okay, so let's see. Where was I? Do that. We'll do that. Okay, so we've got our form. We've got the action. We've got the method. And this is where I think, I guess a lot of JavaScript developers don't even really get here, because we want to do things the cool way. So you can see that I've been messing around with this, and it's like reloading the browser. And if I don't use that, if I do it like this with this target, without the target equals blank, and we go back to our form, let's close all that, and we reload, I can send some data, and all of a sudden what happened was my form's gone, my application's gone. It's been replaced by this new request. And that is how HTML works by default, which is not a super snazzy, sexy interaction that we want. Ideally, we kind of want to hit submit and then send that request behind the scenes. So how are we going to accomplish that? Well, with some JavaScript. So I'm going to go down here. I'm going to... That's funny. GitHub Copilot wants me to install a package called Bedrow.js, which I'm guessing it got from my Bedrow CSS, which is actually Bedrock's, and this is Bedroj's. Anyway, just thought that was funny. So let's actually build this out, right? We want to put in some client-side JavaScript. So I'm going to call that client.js. I'm going to say the type equals module, because I think that that's a more modern way of loading things. I probably could put this in the head and have it deferred, but it's actually really easy to just put it after and not have to worry about order of things. So I'm going to keep with that. So we've got our client.js file. We need to include that. And because our source folder is, or Fastify is set up to serve the source folder as static assets, which probably means the server.js file should not be in here. But that's fine. This is just demo purposes. We can link to this file from index.html. So this is going to go from the root folder to get our client.js file, which is just going to be right here. And now we've got some work to do. So what do we want to do? I think essentially what I want to do is loop over all of the forms. When this file loads, I want to loop over all of the forms in the document. So I'm just going to go for const form of document.query selector all, get me all my forms. And from there, what do we want to do? We want to submit the form with JavaScript. So form.addEventListenerSubmit. That is an interesting suggestion. GitHub Copilot, close, but not quite. So what we're going to do is use a little bit of that. We are going to, essentially submit this form. So I'm going to pull this out a little bit. Let me step back here. So we want to submit our form with JavaScript. So what I'm actually going to do is pull that into a different function. I'm going to say function JS submit form. And what that's going to do is it's going to take a submission event. So it's going to take this guy, this submit event, right? Event. And we're going to give that the typings of a submit event like that. Oops, that's not it. Param, there you go. So now this is a submit event, same as what we have here. Awesome. And what we're going to do is say whoa, that's a lot. We're not going to do that. Let's see. The form element is the event.target. Thank you, GitHub Copilot. The URL that we want to submit the data to is the form.action. And what happens if the form doesn't have an action? So, right, because valid, this is perfectly valid JavaScript right here, or perfectly valid HTML. So what we want is to submit, but not break anything. Essentially keep the behavior as similar to the default as possible. So I'm going to save this, and nothing's going to work right now, or no JavaScript's going to run. Let's just see how this goes, just in case you're not familiar with how this works. Is I'm going to say I'm submitting this form to Austin. So that may have been too fast for you to see. You can see that the word is gone, and that's because the page has actually refreshed, and it's submitted that GET request, same as we did to our API before. And this is the default browser behavior. So this is kind of critical to know, is that if you are ever building something for the web and you are doing want to build it in a way that is progressive enhanced, then you Israel's on the show. What up, Israel? I can only see your comments, but it's good to have you. Good to have you here. Thanks for stopping by. So yeah, if you're building stuff for the web, something that's really important to me is the progressive enhanced nature. Is you essentially want to make something better without breaking what is already there. So keep the existing behavior the same, because that's what people expect. So if we're going to keep it the same, essentially the default behavior is the baseline. That's what we want to recreate with a JavaScript fetch request. So if a form, let's see, if the form does not have a URL, then we are going to use the window.location.href. Okay, cool. Good start so far. And now let's go ahead and start building out this fetch request. We're going to say essentially return fetch URL. Fetch takes this second options parameter. So I'm actually going to build that out because I think I'm going to have to modify that at some point. So const options equals that. We are fetching to the URL. We're not doing anything. We are doing something with the form. We want to pass those options as a second parameter. And now the next thing is, this should kind of work as is. So let's see. When we submit it, we want to JS submit the form with the event. And then why don't we console log the response? Okay. So by the time that we are here and we submit this event, that should essentially be the equivalent of using fetch to do all this work. Okay, let's try that. Going to open up my console here. Going to say, hey, and submit that. And we saw a little tiny thing flash up here in the console, which if I keep submitting it, the reason why it disappears again is because the page keeps reloading. Essentially, I think right now we're submitting both requests because we're taking the form, we're grabbing the data, we're passing that into a fetch request. That's coming back with a response, but at the same time, we're using HTML to send that request the de facto HTML way. I hope you're enjoying the show, Israel, man. Get some friends on. Tell your mom, tell your dog, get your grandma on here. Cool. So we're submitting the form. The thing that's missing here is, and if you've ever done this with JavaScript before, you probably know, we actually need to take that event and prevent the default behavior, right? So where do we want to do that? Is we want to do that not in this event handler, I don't think, but actually here, because probably prevent default. Cool. The reason why we do that here is because most likely any time that we're using this helper function on any form in our app, we don't want to also have to call, we have to call this at some point, but we don't want to do it every time we add the event listener, we can just throw it in the body of this function and it will take care of that. Israel is saying Kiwi and Tofu are here with me, trying to get them to learn some web dev. Not successful yet. Well, we're starting now. So hopefully this will get them. This is the right resource. I should get Nugget in here to teach Kiwi and Tofu some web dev. That's the secret. Okay, so we're back to our code, right? We're using this function, this helper function, to submit the event. We're going back to our application. And now if I hit test and I submit, the website does not reload when I submit the form. And that's great. And in fact, we get a response object because we sent our fetch request. So we have everything. We can get the response body if we want. And that's working pretty well. So now let's see, let's try that again. Cool, it's not reloading. Now we want to be sending these requests to our API endpoint, right? So maybe it would be helpful if I start over here. How I see a lot of applications built is you might do something like document.query selector for my form. And then on my form, I would do add event listener with the event. And I would do event.prevent default again so that we don't reload the page. And then I might do something like fetch, let me see, /API, right? This was the request that we were kind of eventually going to make. And right, let's look at that. We do that, we hit that, we submit the form. Nothing happens. Why is nothing happening? Oh no, something's happening. Yeah, we're submitting the form. We're hitting that API endpoint. We are getting a response. But now, yeah, let's build it this way. How do I get my form data? Well, how do I send this request? Is I might actually make this like a post request, right? Method is post, body is something like JSON stringify hello world. Yeah. So that's cool. If I do this, I can go back to my application, reload. I actually don't even need to submit this or fill this information out because I know what data I'm sending. And I can see my payload here is hello world. Now, if I want to grab this data from the form so that when the user submits this, I'm actually putting my form data into the request. Great way to do that is to say that, let's see, my form equals the event target, const data equals the new form data of the form. And then we're going to say that the search params is actually I'm going to call this form data. Cool. And now I want to send this data. Search params. So this is a really handy way to use HTML to declaratively state what the data is simply by using the name. So now I don't need JavaScript or, I don't need state management or anything like that to keep track of some value. I can just use HTML to send this. let's see, we submit the form, we look at our network request, we look at the payload, and something is not sending correctly. That is because I'm sending it as JSON. That's right. That's not right. I shouldn't be JSON stringifying it. I want to just do that. Cool. So hit that, we get a 415. We can see that our form data is being sent with name and test. What is the response? Status code 415. Invalid media type, unsupported media type, unsupported media type, URL form encoded data, or XWW form URL encoded. Okay, so this is a simple problem. Well, not a simple problem. The reason why we're running into this error. Actually, let me fix it so that you can see what it might look like otherwise. Is we can say JSON.stringify. URL search params are not an object that can be stringified. So what we need is something like object from entries with our URL search params, and then we stringify that as the JSON payload, I believe. Reload there, hit that. We're not getting an error. We are seeing that our payload now is sending the data that we want with the name and test. And so far, we don't have something like React hooks or Vue reactive data binding or anything like that. We're just using HTML. It's actually pretty sweet. So another problem with this approach is we're still kind of relying on individual fetch requests to get the logic. So if I have a different form to a different endpoint, I'm going to kind of have to do this whole same thing again. So what I was doing here before is abstracting that logic so that all of the form submission and data capturing logic is declared in HTML and then pulled out with JavaScript. Because another disadvantage of using it this way is that it's very dependent on JavaScript. Like this right now would not work with just HTML because our plain HTML form is not submitting to the correct URL. So let's fix that. Form action equals API. That's the method we want to send to. The form method equals post, right? We want to send our data to that URL. So with that information on our form object, we can actually replace the API, well, the URL in the fetch request and the method. We can pull that off of the form. We're going to get rid of doing things this way. We're going to do this the way that I think is nicer. And we're going to, again, set up this fetch request. We're going to set up our options. We know our options. We need to define the form, well, the method. The method we're going to pull off of our form.method. If the form doesn't have a method defined, I don't know if it defaults or if we want to explicitly say that. So let's check that out. So if our form doesn't have a method and we submit it, it looks like it defaults to get. That's good. That's what I would define. Just wasn't sure if that was actually going to print. That's what I would expect. So we can leave that as post. If we go back to our form and submit it, Now we can see that it's a post request. Cool, cool, cool. And that's all lowercase. Good to know. Even though I've capitalized it here. Okay, so the next step is going to be in client.js. Well, the next step is if it's a GET request, then we want to send the data in the URL here, right? So the difference is going to be if I want to send an object that's like A is 1, that's the data I want to send. With option 1, with a GET request, that would be something like A equals 1. It's like whatever my URL is, my URL, my URL, and then question mark A equals 1. That's on a GET request. On a post request, looks like this. Method is post. Body is, if we want to send it as JSON, if our backend server accepts JSON, then we can send it as JSON, stringify the object. We can also send it as form data, or we can send it as URL search params, like this new URL search params with our object. So here I'm basically showing that we have two different behaviors that we want in order to imitate or emulate what the default browser behavior does. And that is when it's a GET request, we append our data to the URL. When it's a POST request, we insert the data in the request body. So, and that's in the options, right? So what we're going to do next is say if the options dot method equals, I want to say if that's a GET request, then we actually want to modify the URL here. And I could say something like URL plus equals well, I guess GitHub Copilot just kind of figured it out for me. Form elements. Never seen that before. Let's see what that is. Yeah, so I could do it that way. And HTML form control collections. Oh, that's kind of cool. It's not quite what I want because that's going to include the submit button, but I'm sure that that is a handy thing to use. I wonder what this does. Well, we'll see. I don't know what that did. That broke something. All right. I'm going to quit messing around with that. So let's see. Yeah. What do we got? Okay. Right. So I want to modify this URL. I could do it this way where I append the a question mark and get the URL search params. Again, what I want is like modify URL to include form data, which would look like example /API turns into /API foo equals bar. And my preferred way of doing this is going to be with using an actual URL object. So what I'm going to do is, instead of just using this as a string, I'm going to actually construct a URL object from either the form action, which is where the form API endpoint is pointing to. And if that is not defined, we'll just use the current location in the browser. And with that URL created, instead of being a string, I'm going to modify the URL by saying the URL dot search. Whoa, thank you, GitHub Copilot. That's not what I want. We have the form, we have the URL, and then const form data equals the new form data with my form. Cool. That's going to give me a form data that can actually be passed directly to URL search params to build up my my search parameters. And in fact, I'm going to pull that out down here and say const search parameters equals that. And that will make sense here in a moment. But what we have here is, if we have a GET request, we're going to modify the URL.search and assign it to a search parameters object. And what that does is essentially accomplishes what we have above, because we can either send this fetch request with a string, or we can actually send it with a URL object, and it will handle like essentially doing this part, which is great. So that's on, I think that's all that we need for the sending data in a GET request. Now we're going to try sending data in a POST request. So if it's not a GET request, it has to be a POST request, because HTML only supports GET and POST, unfortunately. But then we're going to say, what was that saying? That's that's really awesome. GitHub Actions just kind of helped me write my documentation. But yeah, we essentially want this to be the search parameters. And there is going to be a modification to make here later on, but we're not going to do that yet. Cool. So we have our function mostly written out, and there's something really important I want to point out about this event.prevent default. I want to put this at the very end of my function, because if anything above here fails, I want my application to fall back to the default HTML behavior. And I guess we can describe or make an example of that is throw bleh. So this is an example where we call event prevent default first, and then we do our work. If we do this and we submit our form and we hit submit, we get, oh no, uncaught, some error happens. And in our network request, our form is never sent. If, however, we prevent default after an exception has occurred, then we submit our form. In our console, we see, really briefly, we saw our error come up, but we can also see that our form ends up submitting the standard way, the HTML way, which is helpful, safer, more resilient. resilient to errors, right? So this was imitating that if there was ever an error that happens anywhere up here, we're going to go ahead and just fall back to HTML. And as long as an error doesn't happen within any of this, we can prevent the default behavior and send that puppy along. Okay, I think that's about as much as I have time to cover today, which is not much. So we've built our little form. We are submitting it with JavaScript. We're posting the data. We are getting unsupported media type. And I think we're going to save that for tomorrow. Well, let's actually fix that. So let's say JSON body is JSON.stringify object from entries. There we go. Reload that. We're submitting our form. Our network request is going out. Our payload is sending our data. And yeah, I think that's pretty good. We got pretty far, I guess. Not really. I mean, maybe we have a server serving some static files. Got an index.html file. It's accessible. Yeah. I think that's it for today. I'm going to come back on this tomorrow. If this is interesting, let me know. If you have questions, feel free. I'm responding to these chats. So yeah, hope you enjoyed, and I hope to catch you tomorrow. Bye.